Very good. It's now 10 o'clock, and it's my honor to welcome you to today's webinar on assessing whole life carbon with levels. My name is Katarina Farage, and I'm the moderator for this webinar today. In that webinar, we're going to have quite some interesting activities planned for you that we're going to show you in a minute. But please observe our meeting etiquette, which means please stay muted and turn your camera off. If that's not happened by default, then please do so manually. We do encourage you, of course, to interact with us. So we ask you to do this through the chat, which you can easily find in one of your menu options. And please be advised, this meeting is recorded and will also be shared on the LinkedIn website. So if you don't want to be mentioned, please also do not put anything in the chat, but of course we encourage the participation of you through the chat. Now, looking at today's agenda for the meeting that we have until 11:45, now. Sorry, I was informed that sound was not working, but here we're trying it again. It is about the agenda of today. We're having a couple of parts of today's meeting. The first one is about understanding the overall context and an overview presentation on levels in general, done by Josephine Lindblom. Then we have a second part, which is an overview of the levels indicator 1.2, done by Shane Donatelli, followed by a Q&A. So that's where you can put in your detailed questions, your interest that you want to put forward. And then there is part 3, which is a more practical side. So we're going to look into examples, 2 examples specifically of putting whole life carbon assessments into practice. So 2 very knowledgeable speakers that we're going to have there who will then also join us for a panel debate where more of this insights and experiences can be shared. The webinar will last until 10:45 or 11:45, sorry. So there's plenty of time for us to listen to these great speakers, but also to listen to your questions and inputs. Now, before we go into the details of the meeting, please do have a look at this little poll that we have prepared for you. You can do that by getting out your phone and scanning the QR code. You can also go to slido.com and then put in the hashtag levels webinar, but I think it's easier if you do just get out your phone, scan the QR code, and then have a go at the question that we have. Because we would like to know how familiar are you with conducting whole life carbon assessments in buildings? We have a couple of options, answer option. You can choose more than one if you want. The first one is, I understand the concept of whole life carbon. The second one is, I'm making assessments, but not yet with the levels indicator 1.2. I am applying the levels indicator 1.2 now in my work. And I am completely new to the concept of whole life carbon, and I'm eager to learn more. So please choose the answer options that are most applicable to you. Again, you can go for more than one. And let us know your level of experience with whole life carbon assessments in buildings. Again, this is going to be very helpful for our speakers also to know where to start, where to end their presentations. Again, I would appreciate if everybody stays muted during the course of the webinar. And I think we have quite a number of contributions already. I'll give it another couple of seconds before we close the poll. There you are. I think we can close, and please see the results. There we are. Now, there's a big majority of people that say I understand the concept of whole life carbon. That is great. So there is already a good basis to work from. Then we have a few that are already working and are making assessments, but not yet with the levels indicator 1.2. So that's interesting. So quite some things that can come out of today's webinar for you there. A few are completely new, which is great because this is going to give you a great introduction and a great overview on the context and everything behind it. And then there are just a small minority, but a few people that are applying this levels indicator. So maybe they're also eager to share some of their experiences. So thank you very much for this little poll and answering this little poll, because it's going to be very interesting for all of us to then see how we develop today's webinar. Please note, though, that this webinar is not going to show you how to conduct a whole life carbon assessment, so not an example with data, but it will instead show you an overview of the concept and the levels indicator 1.2. Having said that, I think it's time now to move into our first presentation. We're going to have two presentations, one after the other, followed by a Q&A. So if you have questions and comments to our presenters, please put them in during their presentation, and we will then be able to pick them up after the presentation. So our first presenter is Josephine Lindblom, who's Policy Officer for Sustainable Buildings at DG Environment. And Josefina has been working for many years in the policy area of sustainable buildings with a life cycle perspective, and she has managed the development of levels to assess buildings' performances. Josefina, we're very eager to hear this introduction that you have planned for us, so the floor is all yours.
Thanks so much. Thanks to everyone who's online, and thanks also for having responded to the to the poll just now, because indeed it's really interesting for us to see as well. Could I have the next slide, please? So I will start with the basics. Why is whole life carbon important in the building sector? I want to stress that if we look at the full life cycle of a building, so from the extraction of materials, the manufacturing of construction products, construction itself, the use of buildings, renovation, end of life in the end, if we look at all of that, the building sector is responsible for half of all our extracted materials, half of our total energy consumption, and a third of our water consumption. And importantly, also actually over a third of our total generated waste. This is in the EU. So it's clear that this sector, or we cannot pretend to reach a climate neutral society if we are not taking a very close look at the building sector, basically. Another slide, please, for me to show also a bit of the typical whole life carbon profile over the lifetime of a building. I have taken this from LETI. This is the London Energy Transformation Initiative. And this is a typical profile from a new and fairly energy efficient building. You can see here that over the lifetime of the building, we have different carbon emissions. The yellow-orange one is the operational carbon. So this is the carbon for heating and cooling primarily. And you can see, of course, how this is going a bit up and down during the lifetime of the building. Renovation, replacements, maintenance typically manage to reduce it a bit in the following years. However, the pink one is the embodied carbon. So this is the carbon which is linked then to typically to materials, but also to the construction and end of life. And here you can see actually that in this standard scenario, The operational carbon and the embodied carbon has more or less the same, they contribute with more or less the same amount. And what we do today, currently, in most building projects and renovation projects, and policies for that matter, is to focus on the operational carbon only. But we want to make sure that we take a more holistic look at carbon. So this gives you a good overview of what it can look like. Next slide, please. This is a draft, or I should say intermediate results from a draft report from a study that we have, which looks at the embodied, well, whole life carbon, in particular embodied carbon, across the EU for different kinds of buildings. So I will not go into detail here, but I just want to show you what kind of things we are looking at. So on this slide, you can see how different kinds of buildings, so single family homes, multi-family homes, and offices, and also for different regional areas, oceanic, the Northern Europe, continental, and Mediterranean. For new, all of these are new buildings. For standard buildings and more advanced buildings, what they look like in terms of embodied carbon, and from which parts of the building this embodied carbon comes from. So yeah, just to give you a flavor of things that are important to look at and which we are trying to get a better grip on as well. Next slide, please. So there are, of course, different kinds of ways of reducing carbon emissions. Here I'm focusing mainly on the embodied carbon on this slide. When I talk about sufficiency, which is about how do we use the square meters efficiently? How do we make sure that we don't have to necessarily build new and still have the same function that we need? Renovation is another one. Instead of demolishing and building new buildings, look at how we can renovate existing building stock. That typically, not always, but typically comes with carbon saving. Circularity, of course, is very important, designed for adaptability and deconstruction, extending the lifetime of a building, etc. That also is a way of reducing carbon emissions. Reducing waste and optimize material use is a key way of working as well. And then, of course, the materials that are being used, how can they be chosen so that they are low carbon in the production of them, and how we source them. So having said that, giving you a flavor of the variety of different kinds of what low carbon solutions can look like, let's go to the next slide, please. Here I have an example. In this case, it's about circularity in action. I've got this from Skanska. They built a new hospital wing in Oslo, in Norway, and they then made the conscious choice of reducing embodied carbon by reusing concrete decks that they took from another building. And as concrete normally accounts for a very high share of the embodied carbon of a building, typically 10%, they were able to reduce the embodied carbon from concrete with 90% by reusing the concrete decks. So that would mean then if we make the calculation that 9% of the total embodied carbon was saved then by using this or reusing these concrete decks. So that's one way of doing it, of course, and a very good example. Next one, please. Having said that, giving you a bit of an introduction to whole life carbon, I want now to present levels as well. Levels is the European framework for sustainable buildings. And if I get the next slide, I will show you what areas levels covers. It is a common language for the full life cycle, and it has been developed together with the sector a few years ago during a number of years, and also tested by the sector. And this is now something that has been published, and we are starting to use it also in policy initiatives, but it's ready to be used by construction or building projects. So this common language, these levels, covers whole life carbon, resource efficient material flows, and efficient use of water. So here you can see the first three ones are really about the use of different kinds of resources, and of course then have a direct impact on the environment as well. But we also have three other areas which are more linked to the quality and value of the building. So health and comfort, adaptation and resilience to climate change, and life cycle cost and value. And if we go to the next slide, I will show you a bit more in detail. So we have the same areas, the same macro objectives, as we call them. They are the same ones as I just showed you on the previous slide. But here we also have the set of indicators which sits under each macro objective. So you will see that when it comes to energy, for example, and carbon emissions, we have two different kinds of indicators, 1.1 and 1.2, and etc. So the different macro objectives have different numbers of indicators. There is nothing more than that to levels. Well, there is a lot of explanations of how to work with them, but these are the indicators that you can see. And today we are focusing on the 1.2. So when people talk about indicator 1.2, it is indeed the life cycle global warming potential. Next slide, please. These levels indicators, whether it's 1.2 or other indicators, can be used at three different levels. So at the first level, one uses the indicator at a concept stage in a qualitative way. So it's there basically to steer or guide the conversation between the client, the investor, and the design team to make sure what to focus on in terms of sustainability performance for this particular building project. And then at the second level, this is at the design and construction stage, then one uses the indicators in a quantitative way. So that's when the calculation starts. And then, of course, at the third level, this is at handover when the building is ready. And then it becomes important to, first of all, check, did we achieve what we set out at level 2, at the design and construction? And how does the building perform once it starts to be used as well? So the indicators typically can be used at these three different levels. And my colleague Shane Donatello, who follows my presentation, will take you through this indicator 1.2, the whole life carbon indicator, at these three different levels to explain to you how it works. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. I want to stress that we have, since about half a year now, a bit more, we have a very nice e-learning accessible on the Levels website, which you will be able to see the link to in the chat later on. You can find lots of different materials there, but I would really encourage you to have a look at the e-learning once you looked at the more general introduction on the website. It has been developed by Arup, and they are in a very good position to provide good material, we think, in this area. You can choose in any way you want to work with the e-learning. You can do it for any kind of indicator that you're interested in, but you can also take a particular e-learning journey, as we call it, depending on your overall interest. So if you're, for example, if you're interested in climate, which we will be talking about today, then the e-learning sets you on a journey to take on the most important levels indicators to do that. So all that is accessible on our Levels website. And with that, I believe I'm done. I would then like to thank you for having listened, and I give over back to Katharina. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Josephina, for this very first introduction into the context, but also into levels and how it links to this infamous indicator 1.2, where we're going to have more details on now in the following presentation. Again, my encouragement, if you have questions still for Josephina, still put them into the chat. You can also still do that during the next presentation, but then indicate that your question is for Josephina rather than it is for Shane, who's going to join us now for the second presentation, where we, as we said, have more details on the levels indicator 1.2 to design, assess, and verify life cycle global warming potential of buildings. Shane, also for you, questions can go into the chat, but first of all, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Katharina. So it's a privilege to speak at this webinar, so many people attending. So I'll try and cater for all needs, so that might be me explaining some things might be obvious to some of you, but new to others of you. So I'll walk you through my presentation. So if we just go to the next slide. Basically, it's structured into some very basic considerations about whole life carbon and what it is, looking at buildings. Then about this underlying EN standard, EN 15978, and how it deals with embodied and operational carbon. And then I'll move into levels, the levels framework, specifically level 1, how that should work in principle. Then levels 2 and 3, and then just some general thoughts from me about when should you do a whole life carbon assessment exactly, and what are some ways ahead or pitfalls to avoid when dealing with whole life carbon assessments of buildings. So on the next slide, we'll go into these general considerations. So here you can see, if you go from left to right, you can see how a building begins. It's basically an idea in someone's head, information on a computer screen, on a piece of paper, and then with time and effort and the input of materials and energy, the generation of some waste, you start to build this building, and and then it gradually, more materials, more energy, more waste, and then you finally end up with this finished building. So everything to get you from that idea to the actual new building is what we call the upstream part of the building life cycle, and it's known as module A in the standards. And then once you have this new building and you start to occupy it, you start to use it, you need energy to use the building, you need to input more materials to maintain the building, repair, replace elements, you generate some waste from that. And this part, which can be for a very long time, can be 50 years, 100 years, this is the core part of the building life cycle. This is also known as module B in the relevant standards. And then at some point you get to the end of life of the building and you decide to deconstruct it or demolish it. And again, you're producing materials and waste from there. And you have to do something with those materials and waste. And basically this is the downstream part of the building's life cycle, and it's known as module C. So if we go to the next slide, I want to explain here just how whole life carbon can really look or evolve in different types of buildings. So really there's this general idea of, in the existing Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, they introduced the concept of NZEB, so NZEB, and that stood for Nearly Zero Energy Buildings. And now we're looking to move to be more holistic than that. So now we're looking at nearly zero emission buildings. And by emission, I mean carbon emissions. And again, this is over the whole life cycle. So really, what I want to explain here on this slide is really, if you want to get to be a zero emission building, which is the dream for a climate neutral Europe and all of that, really what you have to be is, as a building at least, you have to be net energy positive. And what I mean by net energy positive is your own building has to produce more renewable energy than it actually needs. And so to try and illustrate how this could work, I've put 3 examples on this graph. So you can see the blue line on the graph is a normal building today that is connected to the grid, just takes in grid electricity, takes in natural gas from the mains. And then you've got an orange line, which is a building with on-site renewables that can more or less meet all of its energy needs on average. And then you've got a grey line, which is a new building with lots and lots of on-site renewable energy production that is more than meets its needs and is a net exporter of renewable energy. So you can see what happens at the very beginning if you look at the graph. From year 0. So on the y-axis, we have this kind of cumulative life cycle carbon, and on the x-axis, we have the years of the building life. So you can see at the very beginning, all 3 buildings have a big spike in carbon. And this is the spike of embodied carbon from all the materials that have to go into the building. And you can see actually the normal building of today has the lowest spike. And you could say this is because it doesn't have this on-site renewable energy system. It's just taken from the grid. So when you go and install, I don't know, PV panels or something else, the embodied carbon of that system has to be counted as well, because it's going onto the building or onto the building site, and it's integrated with the building. And then this would add up and give you a bigger spike in the embodied carbon. So in the grey building, you see it's an even bigger spike because it's even more, a larger on-site renewable energy system. But then you see what happens as the building lifetime goes on. You can see the blue building, even though it had this relatively low peak of embodied carbon, as it's being used, that carbon just gradually increases because of the carbon associated with the energy used. And you can see little extra peaks every 10 years, and that's just assumed for embodied carbon of maintenance materials coming in every 10 years. You can see the orange line, it kind of ends up after the initial peak, it kind of just treads water. So it doesn't, the operational side, it's not really going up at all. And there's these little spikes caused by the embodied carbon every 10 years, but it's generally holding its own. It's not going up with time, but it's not going down either. And then with the grey line, you can see this bigger initial peak is more than compensated for eventually by this operational phase where the export of renewable energy is really bringing the life cycle carbon down with time. And again, they also have little peaks of embodied energy, embodied carbon every 10 years, but you know, the real operational energy, operational carbon side is really bringing that down. And eventually, after around 40 years, you can see they actually get to this nearly zero emission, or zero emission building definition. So they actually get there. But the question is now, we have this definition of nearly zero emission building. And for me, the question with levels, we try and frame this into a 50-year cycle. So we can say when we think this zero should be looked at. But when you're talking about nearly zero emission buildings, the question is, how near do you have to be nearly zero? So this is still a question that, as far as I'm aware, hasn't been answered. It's still up for debate. And it might be at member state level, they have their own definitions. It's still to be seen. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, just to give you an example, a real example that we hope to build. This is proof, if you like, that the Commission is trying to practice what it preaches. This is the concept design of a new building for the Joint Research Centre of the Commission in Seville. And you can basically see the idea behind it is to be highly net energy positive, so to produce a lot more energy on site than it actually needs, renewable energy, I should say. And you can basically see it's like this sort of grid of square panels formed in some sort of dome-like canopy. And the idea is that this will produce, you know, a big surplus of energy, but at the same time shade the building underneath from the excessive heat that often exists in Seville. So it has like a double benefit. And it's really, you know, the idea is not if it's going to be a net zero emission building, but just when it's going to become a zero emission building, if it's 20 years, 40 years. So we just need to know in more details about the embodied carbon when the more detailed design takes form. And I should say that this type of approach, buildings where there's a large plot area, big car parks, you know, it's not just like a one-off project that nobody else should even think of doing. This is a kind of idea that could be used, especially in hot climates and sunny climates in Europe. So it's a potentially interesting building design. But then I'll move on to the next slide. And here I just want to get into the underlying EN 1598 standard. So if you remember this, this module A, B, C of the buildings that I showed you, you can see the EN 15978 standard has the same approach. So it's going from left to right. It starts with A1 to A3, A4 to A5. So this is all about building the building. The A1 to A3 is on like making the elements and the construction products. A4 and A5 is about putting them together on site, getting them to site, put them together to make the building. And then B1 to B7 is this use phase of the building for many, many years. And then module C1 to C4, this is like after the end of life, what do you do with it? And you can see standing next to that, but separately, is module D. And this is what happens to those materials and wastes and so on that come from the demolition or the deconstruction of the building. What happens to them afterwards? And this is kind of beyond the scope of the initial building, but it's important information to know to see if it's potentially beneficial somewhere else. So we do say in levels and in this standard that you should always report module D separately. But I should also say that this standard was published in 2011, and a new version is imminent. So I think next year it should definitely be a new version of this standard. And I think it has the same life cycle stages, but it might have more details and more nuances to clarify things. And I think there might be a B8 coming in that is going to be optional, but watch this space. So on the next slide, you can see here, if you're looking at embodied carbon, the type of information you're going to get from the suppliers of construction products. You're going to get information on modules A1 to A3 and on module C1 to C4 and module D. And that's in line with the new standard for environmental product declarations for construction products. And really, the onus is on the people running the building project to make good estimates and assumptions for this module A4 and A5 and on module B, because people who are making the construction products really don't know what exactly you're going to do with them. So really, you have to, as you as a responsible for a building project, have to come in and supplement the assumptions and information for A4 to A5 and module B. So if we move on to the next slide. Yeah, just zooming in on module B, specifically module B6, which is where a big chunk of the operational carbon can potentially come to, and it could be a negative if it's you have this on-site renewables that are over-designed for the building's needs, but it could also be positive if you're just taking grid electricity. So but those numbers are dominated by B6, and really you have to think carefully. What is the scope of the operational energy use? So we have this existing Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which really focuses on the main technical systems in the building. So it focuses on heating systems, cooling systems, ventilation systems, lighting systems, and hot water producing systems. But there's also other uses that are important, and this what we would call the plug load. So you're plugging in your television, your computer, your washing machine, you're running elevators. Nowadays you might even be plugging in electric vehicles. So you have to be very careful, how you define the scope of your operational energy, because it's just becoming more complex, and especially for people who want to bring renewable energy systems on site to get this low carbon operational phase. It becomes even more complex because you have this added potentially exporting and importing balance, because your on-site renewables are not always going to match your current needs. So imagine an office during the weekend with PV panels. They're going to be exporting potentially during the weekend and importing on a Monday morning when the sun's not shining so much. So really, it's important to have this to get good estimates here. It's really important to have a building energy management system in place so you can control those numbers and manage them well. And then also, it's really difficult. There's a big uncertainty with grid factors. If you're using a grid electricity, like how's that going to evolve over 50 years? It's quite difficult to know. So on the next slide, I move into levels now, and so we see, level 1. The good thing about level 1 is it's a nice entry level. Anyone can participate, any stakeholder in the project. It's at the stage of the conceptual design of the building, and really this is the exact stage where you can get the biggest benefits, where your decisions have the biggest potential impact. And in the levels reporting format, we've produced a table where we've identified 6 concepts that we think must be part of the concept design discussions. You can add a 7th or an 8th point. There's no limitation here, but we think these 6 should at least be considered and be part of the conversation. And so just to walk you through them very quickly, the first one is the building shape and form. So this is fundamental. So this, you know, whether it's a house, a detached house, a semi-detached house, terraced house, a block of flats, this makes huge difference to how many materials you need for a given internal floor area. It also affects the ratio of internal volume to exterior area of building envelope, and this in turn affects, you know, the potential heat gain and heat loss across those envelopes, and also the quantity of insulation that might be needed, and so on. So there's, you know, just something so simple as the shape and form of the building can have a massive impact on life cycle carbon. Then it's also to consider trade-offs. So between operational carbon and embodied carbon, and it's like, how much embodied carbon do I need to invest to reduce the heat loss? So this could be, how much insulation carbon should I be putting into my building to reduce my operational carbon? There's going to be an optimum there for each building, so you need to consider these type of things over the whole life cycle perspective. And then there's other things like, what are the carbon benefits of bringing in reused elements, recycled content, and maybe lightweighting of the building itself. Other ways to get the same structure with less materials, to optimize the structural design. Then it's also about, do I choose materials that might be a little bit more expensive, but they're more durable, or they're designed for repair so I can repair instead of replacing? What carbon can I save there? And then there's things like design for adaptability. There's a specific levels indicator on that. And this is about, how easy is it for me to change the internal layout of the building when the occupants' needs may change? So how less destructive can I make that? And can I reverse that back? You know, so can I have a building space that's really adaptable? And at the end of life, if you have a building that's designed for deconstruction, we have levels indicator 2.4 to look at this more specifically. But it's like, this is really your module C benefits. If you design for deconstruction, you can get better results in module C and probably module D as well. So if we go on to the next slide, in this slide, we compare, you see on the top, on kind of right, you can see this is the EN 15978 framework, going from module A to module D. And then you can see the, on the bottom half, you have the levels reporting format. So you can see it really matches up exactly. It's the same split of life cycle modules. So the mandatory ones that you have to report on to get your result would be the kind of red, in the red circle. And then the blue circle is this, you know, side-by-side reporting of module D. And you can see that it's split up into fossil carbon, biogenic carbon, and land use change carbon, and you can add those up together. What levels adds to this standard? So it has the same framework, but what it adds is you have this functional unit defined, so it's meter squared of usable internal floor area per year, and that is over a reference study period of 50 years. So levels kind of, you know, takes a further step and tries to define, for the sake of comparability, tries to, you know, narrow down how to report on life cycle carbon in terms of functional unit. And then on the next slide, another thing that levels adds is it defines a minimum scope for embodied carbon, and actually also provides, to help explain what this minimum scope is, it also provides a hierarchy of building elements as well. So you can see here tiers of building elements. There's tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And sorry, this table was really big, so it's really just one table, but I had to split it in almost half. So reads from top to bottom when you go from left to right. But basically the tier 1 is like, splits a building into a shell, a core, and an external works. And then beneath those you have like tier 2 breakdown of each of those, and then a tier 3 breakdown of each of the tier 2 parts of the hierarchy. And you can see here, I've just highlighted electricity generation is very much included in the scope of levels. So when you bring those on-site renewables into the building, the embodied carbon of those systems is also supposed to be counted with levels. So if we go to the next slide, also to match up with those this minimum scope of embodied carbon, we also provide some default service lives for those same parts of the building. So in case you don't have any better information from your suppliers, you can use these default service lives, which I won't go into detail, but you can see them all there on the right-hand column of this table. So in the next slide, another thing that Levels adds is we created, at least between 2017 and 2020, we created an indicative list of software and databases that we thought were compliant with EN 15978 and the Levels methodology. This is available on the JRC website, but I do say it has to be updated. And for the sake of, for the purpose of updating it, we've created an online survey which anyone can fill out. And whether you have a database or an LC software or a national methodology, that survey has some fields that you could fill in to help us gather information about all the systems and software and tools that are out there. And when the time comes to updating this list, I would say we should do it in an Excel format because it reads a lot better than the current Word document that is up there on the JRC website. And you have a link to the JRC website at the bottom of this slide, and also a link to the survey as well. So on the next slide, the question here for me is an important question is when to do a whole life carbon assessment. And here you can see the same images as before, going from left to right, going from this concept design to the real building and then to the deconstruction of the building. And on the bottom half of this slide, you can really see what does that mean in terms of real numbers, a real understanding of the whole life carbon estimate, which is always an estimate. You never actually have the precise number because there's so many variables involved. But you can see at the planning stage, it's kind of cloudy, there's a lot of uncertainty, and then this cloud gradually becomes more concrete, so to speak, and you can see the uncertainties kind of decreasing as your design becomes more detailed, as you get more specific data for your construction products, as you know how much waste you're really producing, and you get on the embodied carbon side, you get to quite a good understanding of the embodied carbon when you get to the point of just completing the building. Then you start to use the building, and on your operational side, the uncertainty starts to increase because you don't know how people really are going to behave. You can always estimate this, but real life, is always a bit more complex, and people might use the building more intensely, less intensely. The grid supplies might change carbon factors that you didn't foresee. There might be refurbishment choices made that are for completely different reasons than the materials are no longer needing replaced. They might choose to replace before that. And then my point is here, like the only time you get the truest idea of the whole life carbon is after the building is deconstructed, and maybe that information is kind of coming too late. So really the idea here is that we always have this kind of idea of whole life carbon, but we don't have I never have a true number. So on my final slide, on the next slide, just to talk about some ways ahead that I see, and I think it's really important when we're doing building life cycle carbon assessments, is to try and harmonize wherever possible, to look at to use the same unit of meters squared. So there's lots of different types of meters squared you can split a building into, and we should try and use the same definition, whether it's gross floor area or internal, open floor area. Also, the scope of the operational energy should be the same, and the element hierarchy should ideally be the same. And Levels is trying to do this so in some way. Also, it's very important the access to databases and inventories in Europe, and that the results really should be machine readable so that people can actually compile this data and produce interesting reports and overviews of what's happening in the building sector, how we're evolving with all these new buildings and new renovations. Yeah, the scope should always be part of that result. It shouldn't be just one number that you don't really know what's behind that number. And so that's also a pitfall to avoid. And other two pitfalls that I think we should try and avoid are setting prescriptive pass-fail benchmarks for whole life carbon, because Depends on when you do that. If you do that at the very beginning, when the uncertainties are high, then I think pass-fail is not of very much value with so much uncertainty. Also, I think in public procurement processes, we should take a lot of care to not make the carbon footprint like a competitive element of competing designs, because at the design stage or concept design stage, the uncertainties again are high, and this could actually be kind of legally questioned. So I think it's important to ask for whole life carbon assessments, but to be very careful when you make the actual numbers of those assessments something really competitive. So yeah, that was all I wanted to say in the presentation. So I'll pass back to Katarina.
Thank you so much, Shane, for this very interesting and detailed presentation, walking us through the different definitions, different steps, different checklists, and so on. So thank you so much for that. There has been a large amount of questions and comments in the chat, and there's a lot of applause coming up for you as well right now from the participants. Could I ask, yes, Josephina to join us? Because we want to try to tackle a couple of the questions in the chat. So by grouping a few of them, but also, of course, by maybe answering a few in one go. Maybe starting with Josephina. There has been a question from Ralph Kierig, who has, how is levels coordinated with all other initiatives from the EU, like construction product regulation or energy-related product directive? And what will be the format of submitting the data?
Thanks. Yeah, I saw that question, and I've given a very brief answer to it already, because I wanted to be sure that we covered it, because it's an important one. But I'm happy to get the opportunity to say a bit more. Yeah, indeed, of course, it is important that what we do on the policy level when it comes to products, when it comes to buildings, etc., are linked, right? And we have actually developed levels for different reasons, with different purposes. Of course, it was also to importantly, to make sure that projects had, as we said, a common language to hold on to. Even if you don't intend to certify your building, you may want to get a sort of a good steer, a good guidance of what to think about and how to do it. And that's specifically also why we introduced this first level that Shane talked about too. So also for beginners in a sense. But another very important reason was that we wanted, a number of years ago, we wanted to be able to incentivize sustainable buildings in our policies, but we didn't have a good definition and understanding of what that was, or at least not a common understanding. So we developed levels, and now that we have developed levels, and we published it back in 2020, we have spent 2021 and a good part of 2022 already to use levels as a basis for bringing in life cycle thinking and circularity into our policies. So the person who asks the question here asks about, for example, the construction product regulation, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, etc. And in all of those and in others, I mentioned that in my answer as well, in the sustainable finance taxonomy, for example, we are using levels as this basis so that we make sure that there is a link between what we do for products in the construction product regulation and what we do in buildings in the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. That link is actually levels. So both of them are referring to levels. So I think that's really important to know. We may not all be super up to date with the different policy initiatives and how the negotiations are going, etc. But indeed, we are using levels for this purpose as well.
Very good. Maybe just to follow up also, because that question was also had the element of the data, right? To the format of submitting data.
Maybe that was unconsciously emitted from my side, but it's because I don't have a very good answer to it.
That's
we do not. I mean, levels provides, as Shane showed you already, it provides what you are supposed to report on and how to do it. But we do not in the Levels initiative, we do not have, for example, a database. We do not have, I saw that in some other questions as well, kept coming in really good ones about benchmarks and can that be made public and so on. We don't have that kind of setup yet. We don't get the information from those who are using Levels. It's not, we don't owe that data, so to say, yeah. But so this here Levels is still referring to different kinds of calculation tools, which we believe are compliant with the Levels setup. But we are not providing a digital format, let's say. That could be something that policies in the future would want the Commission to do, and then we would look at Levels to see how we would do that. But we are not there yet.
Okay, yeah, perfect. And it indeed answers quite a number of questions that came in that direction as well. Maybe moving over to Shane, to you, and maybe is this a bit of a repetition, but I think it's good because it's important to repeat sometimes, because it's a question about a definition for net zero buildings, zero emission buildings. Is there a definition proposed already, and what would that be?
Yeah, I would like to know the exact answer to that, but I think looking ahead, looking at what they did in the past with the definition for nearly zero energy buildings, I thought it was a mistake. So they gave this kind of freedom to member states to define what does a nearly zero energy building mean, and you get 20 different definitions of what that means for office buildings and for residential buildings, and for me it's a mess. So really what we have to avoid repeating that mistake when we get to nearly zero emission buildings. And we have the advantage, back then we didn't have levels, and now we do have levels. So for me it'd be really important to try and peg any definition of nearly zero nearly zero emission buildings to something like levels, like this 50-year cycle, and looking at the same modules covered by the standard, and then using the same floor area for the definition. So I really think we need to try and at least harmonize as much as we can when making that definition.
Okay. So it's not there yet, but it should definitely come. And ideally, of course, including also learnings from the past of what a definition should include, and maybe also the details it should have. Thanks, Jane. Then maybe not surprising, there were quite a couple of questions towards you for specifically on the indicator 1.2. So there was a question by Paulo Negro who says, does indicator 1.2 use carbon or carbon equivalents as a unit?
Sorry, it should be carbon equivalent, of course.
Okay, so clear clarification. Thank you for that. And then, is there a specific app, and so which one is accepted to calculate whole life carbon to the levels indicator 1.2? So, is there? How do you calculate it? Is there an app? What is the way?
Yeah. I mean, when we were doing this indicator in the first place, we saw there's like a lot of like free market elements out there, software designers developing and updating their tools, watching very carefully what we're doing. There's people spending a lot of time and effort and money on creating databases, and we decided not to be too hands-on on that side of the whole business, and so we've kind of stepped back. So we've created like the framework, how we think the method should work, and then we've left the kind of free market side for people to develop tools and software that can actually deliver this. So this is why we created this indicative list of things that we think are compliant. But as I said, it needs to be updated. I think in the last 2 years, a lot has changed. So yeah, we don't have one such app or thing by the Commission. We decided not to get involved in that.
But do you see any developments in the market around there? I mean, do you detect anybody picking this up?
Yeah, it's a hot topic, and everything's moving at very fast pace, especially on the embodied carbon side. I think, but if you measure embodied carbon, you can probably quite quickly adapt to go to whole life carbon as well.
Okay, good. So also there, things are moving. Very good. Josephina, also, I mean, loads of questions, so I'm trying to pick a few, but one that maybe goes a little bit into moving forward. Because there's a question from Katja Radinova who's, have you thought of a fourth level, 2 levels, that does a kind of controlling whether the targets are achieved or not?
Yeah, I saw this one. Good question. But I really would say that the level 3 that we have now, so the third level, the last level, is intended for that, so that there are a number of indicators which will be important to continue to monitor as you are starting to occupy and use the building. And levels explains how to do that, provides methods, you could say, for that, for those indicators. And then there are some indicators, perhaps, which are where it's more important to look at what the indicator looks like at handover. So not necessarily continue to monitor it the first 1 or 2 years. For example, the embodied carbon, Shane can correct me if I'm wrong, but there I think that the main, you could say, risk for a gap that you could have between what you have designed and what you actually get is to compare it then with what you got at handover, because the building is built then you will of course renovate later on, but that is not in the first couple of years, that's much later, right? So I see Shane is politely nodding, so that's reassuring. So no, there is no intention to put it a fourth level, because if I understand the question correctly, we are really providing that service, if you wish, with the third level. Could I choose a question?
Yeah, of course.
Because I thought there was a really good question about benchmarks, and I know I touched upon it before as well, but several people were saying, are you going to provide a database with benchmarks and what people have been, the results that have come in and so on. And as I said before, we don't have access to that data. We haven't set up a system which gives us the right to hold that data. That could come in the future, but that's not the situation right now. But I still think the question with benchmarks are important to touch upon a bit more, because the levels per se, for none of the indicators does it set benchmarks. It was a conscious decision when we started the first year, let's say, of the levels development back in 2015, when we had a great collaboration with different kinds of building professionals. Well, we had that for many years. But what was really felt as missing at the time was this common language, but not that the EU would necessarily set benchmarks or limit values for all the different indicators, but that could rather be the work for, let's say, national or regional policies, or a municipality who works with green public procurement to set use levels as the methodology, as the common language, but then they would set their own limit values or benchmarks or targets, whatever you want to call it. So it is in that spirit that levels itself has been developed. Now, it doesn't mean that the Commission doesn't care about, for example, whole life carbon, and that we think that it is important that we do have a trajectory to bring this down substantially. We have our overall policy about becoming a climate neutral by 2050 in societies, and buildings are enormously important to be able to manage that. So while we have started to work with policies that will then require the assessment and reporting of whole life carbon, but without at this stage actually setting limit values. I mentioned before, we have the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, we have sustainable finance, etc. We are doing that, but of course, in the future, and I don't know, I cannot say in how near future, I certainly believe that we would have to start to include also limit values at some point. And we will have to see how that would work. Will the limit value come from the EU, or will the EU simply require member states to start to work with that or not? We need to see the best way for doing that. And we will hear a bit later, of course, how Sweden is working with that as well, right? But just to say that it is important to get a good understanding of what the situation looks like today. What is the baseline? Where are we starting from when it comes to whole life carbon? And there is, I would say, we need much more information on that. Some countries, some member states have quite a good overview actually, but most countries, most parts of the EU do not have that. So we are working with different kinds of studies which are helping us to fill those gaps, let's say. But of course, there's only so much EU studies can do as well. So we need member states and regions to start to track this as well and to collect their data and be aware of what it looks like. Because otherwise, I think it will be difficult to suddenly, in a couple of years' time, catch up. I think it's important that even if we don't have benchmarks today, we need to be aware of what our building projects look like. And their levels can certainly be of help. And also rest assured that what the Commission will be proposing eventually in the future in terms of this will be based on the levels methodology.
Right, good. Maybe just to quickly follow up, because these questions, of course, are still coming in, and I think it's an important one to clarify, or a group of questions. Maybe first, is level going to be mandatory? And maybe as a combination to that, can it be certified or used as a standard like others that are existing? Josephina.
Levels is not a certification scheme. So that was your second question, I think. When we developed and tested levels, we had great collaboration with most of the certification schemes operating in the EU, or EU schemes, I would say. And they are, to a great extent now, aligning themselves with the levels indicators. So that's very interesting as well. But it doesn't mean that levels will become a certification scheme per se. There we have good schemes already, and as I said, they are looking to align themselves. Your first question was, will it become mandatory? I do not think that we will at any time soon see the whole package of levels indicators, 16 at this point in time, becoming mandatory. But we do see how certain indicators, in particular the one we're discussing today on whole life carbon, is gradually it's being used as a basis for bringing in this concept into policies. And if we look at the Commission proposal for the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which today is, I would say, most of us think is the most important piece of legislation at the EU level for buildings. In the proposal for revision now, there is a reference to work with levels to assess and report on whole life carbon for large buildings over 2,000 square meters up by 2027, and for most buildings, almost all buildings, by 2030. So there you could say it starts to become mandatory in a sense. Now, this is under negotiation with Parliament and member states, so we see where this takes us, but this is the suggestion from the Commission.
Thank you, Josephina. And maybe to round off this round of questions and answers, Shane, there are two, I think, rather concrete questions building on your presentation. And maybe the first one is one for people that maybe don't have enough information or all the data. So what happens if you don't have enough information to insert all the elements of the minimum scope for embodied carbon? Does it not work then, or what is it?
Well, this is something we're finding from real feedback, is the levels minimum scope of embodied carbon is actually really comprehensive, and they're actually saying right now it's really difficult to get that information for some parts of that hierarchy. And this is a kind of we're learning by doing, and I think there's going to have to be at some point some realistic compromise, like some mandatory information that we think everybody can get in most building projects, and then there's going to have to be this optional other, and maybe they have to be reported separately, because it's not fair to compare one building that only covers part of the hierarchy with another building that covers the full hierarchy, because that other building is going to look worse when it's probably not worse. So this is part of my reason of why it's really important to make sure that when you're reporting these numbers, that you can also click a button or see a table with exactly what's included behind, what is behind that number. And I think, yeah, it's tricky right now. Hopefully the market, as more people start asking for these data to suppliers and so on, that they start getting their ideas together and being able to generate that information to provide to their customers.
Yeah, that would be beneficial. Yeah, Josefina, yeah.
No, just
Sure.
to say that I think it's important to keep in mind that the development of this is going really fast. Shane mentioned that before as well, and it's important, we think, to keep our targets, our vision high of where, or the level of ambition, I should say, where we want to go. We will hear. So I think it's important to not step back and think, no, we can't do it, because we know that many projects can do it, and it's more about providing that journey, that how do we get there. And we will hear from Swedish experience later on here today, how they are working with taking those different steps, for example. So I think that'll be a good introduction to that kind of thinking as well.
Thank you, and thank you also for rounding this off. Shane, there's also been quite some comments on Module D, but I also understand, of course, that this is calculated differently or separately. So maybe, but do have a look, both of you, still at the chat, because there are more questions in your direction. See if you can still answer a few of them during the course of this webinar. But for the moment, I want to thank both of you for your great presentations and for being available for answering those many, many questions and as many as we could fit in to this time slot. So thanks to both of you for the moment.
Thanks.
We would then move on to part 3 of today's webinar, which goes into the examples of whole life carbon assessment for buildings and how levels can help into those. For this purpose, we have 2 presentations, and we're going to start, at least to my information, with Cecile. And Cecile Imbert started her career in finance, but then moved on and founded Fern in 2018. And Fern aims to provide circularity solutions for the construction sector. So there we go, Cecile. We're really interested in hearing more from you of how we can put levels into practice.
Thank you, Katarina. So first of all, I would like to thank all Levels team for the invitation this morning, and also thanks especially Josefina that I met a few weeks ago in a roundtable in Barcelona on the circular built environment. And Josefina asked me to give you this morning a feedback on a concrete project, an office renovation project developed with the Levels framework for a French insurance company. Thanks to the audience for your indulgence, because as it's important to say that it was the first time that we used the framework level as a project manager and architect for a renovation project. And we were assisted by Eco-Intelligent Growth, a circular economy consulting and innovation company based in Barcelona. They based on the cradle to cradle principles, they developed the lean to cradle true value methodology that we also implement on this project. Can we have next slide, please? Thank you. So it's as I mentioned, it's a renovation project that we carry out for a French insurance company. It was a major renovation because we address interior design, electricity, heating, ventilation, and climatization. The surface of this project was 500 square meters, and the project has lasted for 1 year. I think it's really important to explain to the audience why we decide to choose and to use Level on this project. Clearly, for the insurance company and the client, it was the first step in the implementation of a circular transition real estate asset. Secondly, with the 6 macro objectives assessed by the framework, you ensure that the project from the design phase makes the right decision to improve sustainability performance throughout the building life cycle. Josefina explained, and for us it was really, really important. We wanted a common language and methodology for all stakeholders to ensure a good execution and also to get reliable result. As you can see on the slide, there was a lot of stakeholders, so it was clearly important for us to ensure that everybody was using the same language and get exactly the same information. And the last thing that if I can say, motivate the client to use Lovell, it's that as a French insurance company, they need to implement a circular renovation strategy and to be able to assess and reduce environmental impact over the entire life cycle of the building in order to comply with taxonomy and the SFDR regulations that are clearly an important things to manage as insurance company. Can we move on next slide, please? So here we wanted to just give an overview of which level do we assess in this project. As you know, level has some flexibility of application, and its scope can be tailored to the needs of the project. As I mentioned in my introduction, it was a renovation project, and after an analysis of the client needs, some of the lowest parameter did not apply. But as you can see, we address on this project the 4 levels. So the first one, resource use and environment performance, that it's split in 3 different ones, and health and comfort, the number 4, that we also address on the different levels, level 1 or 2 or 3. So to make it clear, it's in gray, you have the parameters that we didn't assess in the project, and the blue one are the levels that we address on this project. Can we move on the next slide, please? So I'm here today to give, as I said, some advice and some recommendation, because for us it was our first project, but I think it's clearly important to keep in mind and some, if I can say, focus that are clearly necessary to ensure a good execution on the project. First one is to be clearly focused on requirement and deliverables. I think a good recommendation is to implement a training for all the stakeholders before the beginning of the project. On the market, on the renovation market, most of building professionals are small, medium enterprise. And unfortunately for them, the levels is an unknown framework. So to ensure a good execution of your project, we recommend you clearly to set up a training on the level for the project stakeholder. The second thing we also recommend is to include the framework in your call for tender to ensure that the building professionals are really focused on deliverables and are able to execute the requirement of the level. And clearly, what is also really important, and I can testimony on that during the project, it's really important as project manager, you have the responsibility to ensure proper coordination between all the stakeholders. So on this project, we implement a weekly on-site meeting with general contractors, and we have also set up online project tracking with AG, the consulting companies that work with us on this project. The second focus that is clearly important, and Josefina and Sean explained and insist a lot of that, is to be clearly focused on sufficiency in materials and design. On this project, we set up a selective diagnosis of product, materials, and waste. In France, this kind of diagnosis is mandatory for renovation of more than 1,000 square meters. This diagnostic of product, material, and waste is a part of the circular economy French law and has been mandatory from the beginning of this year. As I mentioned, our project was below 1,000 square meters. It was only 500 square meters, but our decision was motivated by our will to improve our results, especially on levels 2, resource efficiency and circular material life cycle. And for us, it was really important to have this diagnostic to be sure and to keep material in use as long as possible, and also to maximize reuse and upcycling of material. As you will see in the next slide, it was a good decision to implement this selective diagnosis before the dismantle process. Can we go on the next slide, please? No, I'm sorry. Can you go back, Katarina? I forgot to address. Thank you so much. It's really important also to have a rigorous selection of materials. Clearly in this project, we only selected product with EPD, and also, and you will see in the next slide, we use as much as possible cradle to cradle product. And also the last thing, it's really to be focused as architect and designer on the design for disassembly and reversibility. We were clearly focused on resource optimization and functional optimization. We work very close with user to get them to design their workspace with more, if I can call it, sobriety approach to reduce environmental impact. To be honest, in office in France, people are very attached to individual desk. That's an issue. So we have also to explain to users that partitioning and individual office make no sense and was not a good optimization of the space in terms of materials. And now, Katarina, if you don't mind, we can go on next slide. So here we put you some data and result on the project. So as I said, we assessed 183 products where these products were analyzed and to be ensured that the products were healthy and cyclable. We have reduce the carbon footprint of the renovation. We reduce of 46% compared to usual renovation made by the client. As I said, more than 40% of C2C product were 40% of product were C2C certified or compatible product. With a focus on materials, we had a 66.4% recovery rate. 29 tons of resources were recovered and recycled. And finally, the last one, the level 2.4, design for deconstruction, we get 74.2 levels index of circularity. That is, and we were very proud of this result. Next slide, please. So to conclude, a few thoughts on this experience. Clearly, for us, as I mentioned, it was the first project, so Levels was really, really helpful to get, as we said, a common methodology and common language, and to ensure that everybody has the same understanding of what it's necessary to implement in this kind of project. It's something really important, and it was also for the client to have a complete assessment of operational and embodied carbon emission. For an insurance company, most important thing also, because it's clearly a big focus right now everywhere in Europe, it's the CFDR reporting. So to get the data to address that on real estate asset for an insurance company, it's clearly important. And it gives a guarantee to this client to be compliant with the European building sector policy. Now I'm not going to lose time on that, because someone asked before, when we had the roundtable with Josefina, I said, maybe if we want to go faster in the transformation of the sector, we have to put level and as mandatory. I think it's still a framework that it's not well known in the French market, especially in for the small and medium enterprise. And we have to keep in mind also that we have to be focused on renovation market, not on the construction market for resource scarcity in the coming years. So I think if we want to, because this framework, it's clearly the solution. And I think that it could help to go faster, as I said, in the transformation of the sector. That's all for me. Thank you very much. I tried to do fast, and I'm sure that I was too long. Thanks.
No. Thank you, Cecile, for that presentation, and also for providing this very interesting and very practical experience that you gathered in the last couple of years. So moving on to the second presentation, before we then welcome Cecile back for the panel debate, we have also Christina Einesen here, who is working at Bovercat, where she's an expert in environment and climate. Christina is going to give us an example from Sweden, so another local example where it is about the climate declaration of buildings. After Christina's presentation, we're then going to go into the panel debate. But Christina, first over to you.
Thank you very much for this introduction, Katarina, and thank you for your invitation. I'm going to give you an update on the work in Sweden with regulation on climate declarations of buildings. And I'm also going to talk a little bit on our work with limit values. I work as a project manager at Boverket, at the Swedish Building Authority, with a governmental assignment on this topic. So we can have the next slide, please. So since the 1st of January this year, we have a completely new regulation in place in Sweden. And this means that those who apply for building permit after this date, they need to leave a climate declaration for new buildings before they receive a final clearance from the municipalities. This is a completely new legislation, new law, a new act and ordinance and provision. This is not part of the building code. And why I highlight this is we see that we want to not to put extra administrative burden on the municipalities, which would have been the case if it would have been part of the building code. So this is a separate legislation. There is a change in the Planning Building Act that climate declaration is a requirement to receive a final clearance. So the municipalities need to check that there is a climate declaration. But other than that, this is not a bigger task for the municipalities. This is an introduction of regulation on a limited LCA, but it's based on a full life cycle analysis. And as you saw the pictures from Shane, the biggest climate impact is and also from Josefina on construction products, but also from the energy use on the use stage. So one of the starting points when we developed this legislation was that it should be included for almost all buildings, but also that this legislation should be able to put in place immediately without further investigations. Try to focus on making difference. We had a focus on the construction products and still not to have too complicated legislation in place, this first step of legislation. In that sense, a full life cycle analysis is quite complex to introduce. So that was the background why we choose to have a limited LCA in this first step of legislation. And we think that this legislation can be built on with the full life cycle analysis, but also to introduce those limit values. So this is the first step. I will get back to the boundaries for this legislation soon. So can we have the next slide, please? So according to this new regulation, a climate declaration need to be registered at Boverket. We handle an e-service for this. And the developer, they get a confirmation directly through email. And this confirmation is to be given to the municipalities before they can give the final clearance according to this legislation. So we can have the next slide. Boverket will be responsible for the supervision. We will check the climate declaration, if the data is accurate and if it's reasonable data. There's no third party control in this regulation. We want to try to keep it simple, but this is something we're looking closer on if there is necessary to have some kind of a third party verification before they make this declaration. But it will be important how we work with our supervision. And the developer, they need to save the documentation. They don't need to send all the data to Boverket, but they need to save the documentation for 5 years. And we can request these documents when we make this control of this declared climate declaration. So during this year, we have been, and we're still developing our new organization for this supervision. And we also develop an e-service for handling this documentation that they need to send to us. And we want to have it in a digital format that make it easy for the developer, but also for us when we perform this supervision. So for us, it has been very important to develop ET systems that support smooth handling of data. It's a lot of data that need to be transformed. First, they will need to get some data from our database if they use generic data. We have this e-service for registering this climate declaration. We want to make it as smooth as possible and adjust to those tools that they are using. And then we have this e-service for the supervision when they will need to send more documentation when we make these sample controls. So we can have the next slide, please. So the construction sector in the industry in Sweden, I think they have accepted this first step of regulation quite well. They think it's quite reasonable to start. It's still a big task in Sweden to do this. But the industry has also highlighted that they want to be prepared for the next step. And they also push this for this. So we left a proposal to the government on a governmental assignment. On a proposal on a next step, a roadmap, and this was given to the government 2020. So the slide here where you see 27, that is the proposal that we left to the government. So the legislation from this year, we don't have any limit values, but they need to declare the load-bearing structures, the building envelope and interior walls. And this need to be declared for module A1 to A5. And then we propose that from 27, it can be appropriate to introduce limit values for module A1 to A5. But we also propose that include more building elements in the limit values, installations and interior surface finishes and room fittings. So more or less the full building is included in this limit value. We also propose that a climate declaration will be extended, so the full life cycle is included, though not all the modules. And we also propose to add some more supplementary environmental information, for example, biogenic carbon storage. And the reference study period that we propose is 50 years, and this is according to levels. So you see, this is the more or less the boundaries that we are working with in our regulation. And the Nordic ministers, they have said that they want to see a Nordic harmonization on climate regulations for buildings. So for us, it has been really important to have a cooperation in the Nordic countries. But we also want to have a Nordic harmonization on an EU level. So this is also one of the starting points when we started this next step of regulation to look on levels and in particular on the indicator 1.2 GBP indicator. So this has been the ambition, but I must say it is not very easy. We have different traditions on working with legislation, but that is anyway what we're currently working on. Next slide, please. So in March this year, we got a new government assignment. We should investigate and propose legislation on limit values to be introduced earlier than 27. So we will give a report with legislation in the May next year to the government. So this is what we're currently looking at. Next slide, please. So we have an important study already in place on to set limit values, and this was a study done by the Royal Institute of Technology. This was on an assignment from Boverket to develop these reference values, and we have them now for detached houses and multi-dwelling block offices and nursery school and schools. Next slide, please. So a proposal was presented at a hearing in August. We proposed that limit values can be introduced 25 for module A1 to A5 for new buildings and extensions, but also include these small building elements, as I mentioned. We also had a proposal on introduce an extended climate declaration with the full life cycle and more building elements, and also for extensions and for reconstruction and earthworks. So this was presented on this public hearing, and we are now currently working on if we should continue with this to introduce this legislation in this matter, or maybe we should divide it in a different time schedule. Next slide, please. I want to highlight an important task for us when we work with these limit values. We have a generic climate database from Boverket, so if the developer uses generic data, they must come from this database at Boverket. Our data for construction products are conservative. It's 25% higher than the average, and this is based on EPDs on the market, representative of Swedish conditions. The purpose for that was to create stronger incentives for designers and constructors to choose EPD data in their final climate declaration. And also that the manufacturer would produce EPDs, but also products with lower climate impact. And so far we can see that this has really increased a lot. We don't have followed up this yet to what content, but we see a major activity in the Swedish construction sector and an increased amount of EPDs in the market. And today the industry itself says everyone knows what an EPD is in the Swedish construction market. We're currently looking on if we should continue with conservative generic data, or if we would choose typical generic data. And this is highly dependent on the EU legislation and the possibility to require specific climate data for construction products. So we really follow the revision of CPR, and we think that when it's possible to require specific climate data, then we will probably shift to typical generic data in our database. So this is really an important question, but more complex when you introduce limit values. So, and my last slide is with some more information. If you want to have information about our legislation, it was quite short of time here, so I have not time to go into details, and you're welcome to contact me if you have further questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christina, for this very interesting experience sharing from Sweden. We'll now have a chance for a short panel discussion, and for that I welcome back Josefina and of course also Cecile. So please, ladies, let's hear about more of those details. Josefina, you're still muted.
Okay, I think it's getting there gradually. Thanks a lot. That's what I said. Really interesting hands-on experience from different angles, right? I would like to ask you both, actually, perhaps starting with Christina and then with Cecile. Is it important, you believe, to have harmonization between different countries, or is that sort of an extra add-on which you could live without, in a sense?
It's a good question. and I think it's important if you want to speed up the work with lowering the climate impact. We think that LCA is an important tool to use this. You need to calculate and identify where is the climate impact before you can take measures. And we think it's easier for the industry since they're not only working in a small market, they work in the European market. So it would be much easier for the industry. That is the main reason for working in the Nordic countries, but it's not only the Nordic countries. So yes, we think it's beneficial for the Nordic, for the industry to, if we can use the same words and the same methodology, then they can use that in different projects and in different countries. So yes, we think it's important.
All right, thanks. Cecile, from the building professional side, do you have a feeling for this?
Yes, it's I share the same point of view. I think it's really important, and I think that this is the industry is calling for harmonization. They want to have a clear visibility of which framework they have to use and what they have exactly to assess. And the problem that we have, if I take the example of the market that I better know, the French market, the building professionals are, if I can say it like that, a little bit angry and get the French government and to say, okay, guys, you put regulation on regulation and regular, but you don't check that we are just good in terms of execution of the first regulation. So maybe, so yes, I think because, and I talk about investor and real estate company, they have most of the time asset in different European country. And I think it's also really important in terms of taxonomy and SFDR that we have harmonization, clearly.
Right. Well, that's reassuring to hear, of course. Is there any kind of policies from the EU side that you think would be important to drive this? And even if you could say something about the order, perhaps, of different kinds of policies to how they would come to drive the market. If I turn to Cecile first now, is that something that you would like to?
To be honest, Josefina, I think we don't need more regulation. I think we have all the regulation to drive a good transformation of the sector. I think as I said, and I talk also about the players that I better know, small, medium enterprise that work on the renovation market. We have to be focused on these people because we all know that renovation will be necessarily the growth market in the coming years for the resource scarcity that we talk. And I think and it's not the big players that are on this market. They are on the construction market. So if we want also to go faster in the renovation market, we need to, and it's exactly what the stakeholder asked to the French government also, to say, okay, guys, just give us, if I can say, a planning and what is the reality of the French market, what we need to address in the coming year in terms of renovation. And I think for them, it's also, we need training. We need training.
I wanted to, because then what you're saying is the industry wants a plan somehow, and it seems to me, Christina, that Sweden is certainly attempting to set out that plan. Would you like to say something about? Well, you already described to us how you've started with certain parts of the building, with certain life cycle stages, and now you foresee to gradually build that on. Is there anything else you would like to add to that? How you see policy can evolve?
We have had a lot of dialogue with the Swedish industry when we're working with this. This is really done in a close cooperation with the industry. And I think that has been really important because we're not experts. We don't build the buildings. So it's necessary to see what do they need in the industry to start to work with this. And they want to know what is coming, what is the next step of the regulation. And the problem is for us, we cannot make a regulation that goes already to the objective, our climate objective 2045. It's too far away, but they want to know what is coming. And they say that it's fine, even though it's in a report, the roadmap. to that and try to clarify, and then we will need to make evaluations and see what is the effect. And as you said, Cecile, that it's really important that we get the small and medium-sized companies on the boat. It's more complicated for them because they don't have the same resources to build up this knowledge that is needed. This is complex area, really. So, this is the mission that we have. We try to see how much can we regulate and how far in advance. Maybe we should have this, you know, if we introduce limit values, should we even introduce limit values in 2 steps? But the industry said that, but it's fine if you have that in a report. That's good enough for us. We in any way know on what direction you're heading. How fast are we going to decrease the climate impact?
All right. I had many questions lined up for you coming in from the audience as well, but we have to cut there. It's been really interesting to hear from you, from the policy side and from the building project side, or actually renovation project side. And I thought it was really good that we were able to include a project with renovation, because there's a lot of questions coming in that area, as you've seen. So great, thanks a lot. We are going to wrap up on our side. First, I will do so by, first of all, before I forget, encourage everyone in the webinar today to provide us with some feedback in a link that is going to come up in the chat. It is really important for us to see how we can, what you thought of it and how we can improve, because we will have future events as well. And secondly, I would just try to gather my thoughts a bit of what I've heard. I think that we've heard from different angles how levels can support efforts when it comes to whole life carbon. It can do so on project level, but also on policy level. It doesn't mean that all projects and all policies are going for that, but I think we are starting to see a movement in that direction, and we will continue to work in this area as well at the EU level. I think that harmonization, it was something that we brought up now in the conversation, but I've also seen it in the chat box. There's a lot of questions and comments and a positive sort of comments on harmonization and the importance of that, and how levels can provide that harmonization. So that's also reassuring. The last thing, perhaps, which we haven't really responded to yet in the way we're working, but it is the willingness to share results eventually as these come in this area of whole life carbon, and how it would help the sector if there were benchmarks built on those kinds of results. So that is something that we take with us also for our future work. And with that, I want to say thanks a lot, and I hand back to Katharina for the very final wrap up. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Josephina, and thank you also for these, I understand, also not quite easy summary, or maybe the next steps after today's webinar. I also want to take the time to thank our speakers for their great presentations. Thank you, of course, also to you as participants for your very insightful questions, comments in the chat. It's been a very active webinar on that side. So thank you so much, not just for listening, but also for participating. I want to thank colleagues from the Career Commission, but also, of course, from the very, very good Levels organization team in the background. They have done a marvelous job. I hope the webinar has fulfilled your expectations today. We do have a next one coming up on the 1st of December, as you see on the screen. So you can join us for that. It is titled Levels, Get Going with the E-Learning and Calculation and Assessment Tools. It is something that we've done in June as well, but because it has been popular and because there was more demand, we're going to do a similar webinar again on the 1st of December. So join us if you want to. Then, of course, please remember there is the very active Levels LinkedIn group. So if you've not joined that, please do so, because it will give you the most immediate updates that you can get on everything that's going on around Levels. And then if you've not done that, please complete the satisfaction survey that was shared with you in the chat earlier. Final words from my side is a big thank you to Shane Donatello, because he has been doing great work for Levels. He will be leaving his position at the Joint Research Center very soon and start a new journey, but he will be very much missed in this circle. And not only has he been one of the founders of Levels, but also starred in so many of our webinars in the last couple of months. So Shane, thank you very much, and we wish you all the best for the next endeavors. With that, thanks to everybody else as well. Thank you for this great webinar today, and I wish you a lovely rest of today's Thursday. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.